Yes, hello everyone. My name is Pulz Melby. This was sort of announced as a performance lecture. I think it'll be more towards the lecture spectrum because some of you might have heard the installation going on out there. So I'll try to explain a little more what's actually going on beneath the hood of it. It's called, so I've called it Speculations on Queer Feminist A-Life, and I realize I've in the accompanying paper, I probably didn't sort of explain that A-Life means artificial life, just in case there was any doubt about that. And I also want to thank G and David, Leonie and Luc for organizing the symposium here, but also for hosting me as a guest artist over the summer at the Speculative Sound Synthesis Project, where this installation was developed. And they've contributed greatly through numerous Zoom talks and suggestions and thoughts and ideas. Okay, but I'll just sort of briefly talk about what KIN is. So it's based on a collection of 25 impulse responses. And they're being processed by an evolutionary algorithm. I might be using evolutionary and genetic algorithm interchangeably during this talk. And sort of conceptually or politically, the design of this algorithm and therefore also the evolution of these impulse responses is informed by a queer feminist perspective. So what do I mean by queer feminist? I'll ask for help from Sarah Ahmed in order to define what queer can mean. And these definitions are non-exclusive, I would want to say. So Ahmed says, if we return to the root of the word queer from the Greek for cross, oblique, or adverse, we can see that the word itself twists with a twist that allows us to move between sexual and social registers without flattening them or reducing them to a single line. Although this approach risks losing the specificity of queer as a commitment to a life of sexual deviation, it also sustains the significance of deviation in what makes queer lives queer. So I would say queer troubles, it destabilizes and it disorients the normative. It produces ruptures in binary notions of not only gender, but also of subject and object, linear relations and stable identities. And I'll turn to Bell Hooks for a definition of feminism. Bell Hooks writes, feminism is a movement to end sexism, sexist exploitation and oppression. Imagine living in a world where there is no domination, where females and males are not alike or even always equal, but where a vision of mutuality is the ethos shaping our interaction. So in addition to a movement that empowers female identifying people in a patriarchal power structure, I understand feminism to consist in an identification of and reaction against multiple intersecting imbalances of power and privilege. These exist across gender, sexuality, race, ethnicity, nationality, income, age, place of birth, and so forth. And in the case of this specific presentation, intersectional queer feminism provides a critique of the biases, norms, and privileges that are inscribed in technology and computing. At the same time, it also offers a speculative and creative potential for realizing other realities than the ones in which we currently live. So I'll talk a bit about KIN and what's actually going on there. First of all, it's comprised of 25 impulse responses that I recorded in and around my apartment in Berlin, so using domestic objects. Here's a list of all of these objects, and I'll just play you a recording of each of these impulse responses in the chronology they're listed here. That's it, yeah. So the last 4 were actually from objects from ethnological collections in Germany. Okay, so we have these impulse responses. They're then being processed by a genetic algorithm. And I'll just give an example of a super vanilla genetic algorithm. Here is defined by John H. Holland, who is, I guess, maybe actually the inventor or the discoverer of genetic algorithms. So Holland writes, we start with a population of n individual strings of alleles, perhaps generated at random. Then we select 2 individuals at random from the current population, biasing towards individuals with higher fitness. Use genetic operators, such as mutation and crossover, to produce 2 new individuals which are assigned to the next generation. And we repeat steps 1 and 2, n divided by 2 times, to produce a new generation of n individuals. Then we return to step 1 to produce the next generation. Okay, so let's take an example from my home of how crossover and mutation could work. So I have decided that instead of using bit strings as the genome, I will use the frequency response of impulse responses. Here, illustrated by my desk lamp, which is actually my favorite impulse response, I think, of all of them, and my double bass, which is funnily not my favorite impulse response. I should maybe start playing desk lamp instead. Okay, let's listen to the desk lamp again. And then the double bass. Okay, so in order to merge these two or have them mate, I do a random crossover in the frequency spectrum at the same point in each, and then I put them together. And here we can see that the double bass comprises the lower end of the frequency spectrum, while the desk lamp is responsible for the higher frequency spectrum. And then the hybrid ends up sounding like this. Okay. Now we move on to mutation, which was the sort of the second important genetic operator identified by Holland. So we now use the hybrid frequency response. And here you might be able to see that probably the mutation that happened was sort of in the lower part of the frequency spectrum, where it attenuated a certain part of the spectrum. And it sounds quite similar, but not completely. So listen carefully. If you've heard this 100 times, as I have, then you would notice the difference. Okay, so let's move on to how this actually sounds when it's played by the algorithm. So this is the second generation. I'll start playing now. So the first generation would be the original impulse responses. And for the first 5 generations, they don't do crossover because they are babies, and babies don't, they don't have sex and make babies. Again, so the only thing that happens here is that they might mutate, and there's other genetic evolutionary operators that I've implemented might happen to them. But this is the second generation at the very beginning. Oh, sorry. Good. So after 2 hours and 46 minutes, it sounds like this. Okay. So I'd argue that this genetic algorithm produces new family relations between the sonorous objects. And yeah, we should put family in a parenthesis. I'll get back to why that is later. And the operators you're hearing here are already the ones I will mention later, sort of in response to vanilla genetic algorithms. So this is already the sort of the algorithm that I will argue for later that you're hearing. But also it creates new speculative materialities by suggesting like these often physical plausible objects that might or might not really exist. And there's some interesting papers on this. One called "Can One Hear the Shape of a Drum?" That is the question, can you identify the exact topology of a sound? That was answered in the 90s with no, you cannot. Actually, it turns out that a sound may derive from several different topologies. And that's why I think that impulse responses and possibly all sounds, they embody a potential for imagining multiple materiality, sort of a utopic materialism. Okay, so that's wonderful that genetic algorithms can do that, but we also need to talk about the dark side of evolutionary computing. And for that, I rely on a couple of books, 3 books here mentioned. Stefan Helmreich's really fascinating ethnography of A-life research at the Santa Fe Institute in the early 90s and early and late 90s. Sarah Kemper's Cyberfeminism and Artificial Life. And there's a chapter in Catherine Hale's famous book, How We Became Post-Human, that also deals with the Santa Fe Institute. So I'll just use some quotes from Helmreich here. He says, "The dislocating dazzle of whiteness blinds many artificial life scientists to the ways their images of kinship and primitivity are cultural constructions built on the foundation of a white cultural imagination. In many ways, the genetic algorithm is animated by this imagination, and the worlds it supports resonate with its logic." And he's not done. He goes on to say, "Like the artificial organisms for which they often code or with which they are often conflated, bit strings never menstruate, ovulate, get pregnant, ejaculate, or have problems maintaining erections. The idea that mating can happen between structurally identical entities recalls what Keller has called the masculine bias of mathematical population genetics." And finally, or not finally for Helmreich, he goes on quite a bit, but here he says, "Monogamous heterosexual marriage, even if random, is considered a realistic template for natural processes of sexual coupling for reproduction." So following Helmreich, I've sort of compiled a non-exhaustive lists of a couple of things that can be troubling about evolutionary algorithms and A-life. First of all, kinship, like A-life and evolutionary computing often conflate kin relations with biogenetic relations, which was a error already committed by sort of anthropologists in the late 20th or late 19th, early 20th century with the people they went out to research, and they couldn't understand why their relations or notions of kinship did not correspond to their own sort of like family structures in the global north. So genetic algorithms often conflate kinship with genetic or bloodline relations. Sex and gender diversity is often non-existent in evolutionary algorithm. Everything gets sort of like reduced to a single neutral gender, which, however, when then situated in a patriarchal society, is possibly more masculine gender than anything else. Genetic algorithms are often modeled on neo-Darwinist notions of evolution. Coming from this, survival of the fittest and digital eugenics haunt many of these algorithms, which is something Sarah Kemper also talks about in her analysis of sort of like computer games from the late 90s, early 2000s. The computer games that were building on artificial life. Genetic algorithms and A-life overwhelmingly originate in research communities of cisgendered heterosexual white males, MIT, Los Alamos, Santa Fe Institute, which were also tied up with the military-industrial complex and sort of big finance, where many A-life practitioners went to ultimately work, developing evolutionary algorithms for investment companies. So as with much computing, EAs or evolutionary algorithms are scaffolded by an idea of information as an ideally pure phenomena, untainted by its channels of transmission. Life is seen as substrate-independent information processing, which is something Christopher Langton, one of the sort of early revolutionaries of A-life, has often emphasized. And this idea of information as a pure thing independent of its channels of transmissions goes way back, at least to Aristotle, who, like with this hylomorphic idea of form and matter, like gendered form and matter as like masculine form, feminine matter. The form, unsurprisingly, is the rational, the pure, the good, and the matter is sort of like the more problematic and a bit yucky. So if the genotype and phenotype in evolutionary algorithms are at all distinct, they often embody a genetical determinism that leaves little room for individual expression outside of the biogenetic domain. So often the genome and like how it's supposed to express itself in an actual world are like so closely coupled that there's, you could say, individual agency becomes, is erased, basically. Okay. So what I call, or like I want to talk a bit about queer feminist A-life, and there I draw on Judith Butler in a fascinating essay called Kinship Beyond the Bloodline, which does not deal with artificial life as such, but a critique of traditional notions of familiar, like biogenetic notions of kinship. But Judith Butler writes, I'm in favor of aesthetic experimentations, sustained hypotheticals, political imaginaries, and critical fabulations. By these, I mean forms of wishful elaboration, experience in the possible, unrealistic projects that boldly claim their own naivety. So I think that feminist and queer theory provides us with tools for identifying and critiquing the norms, privileges, and biases of social structures, institutions, and phenomena, such as technology. But in addition to a critique, they also afford speculation and the imagining of other realities, futures, and utopias. So here's a selection of texts that I've enjoyed reading over the past several years, but that has also helped me in sort of critiquing A-life, but also thinking through utopias or possible futures in which A-life can be, we can say, queered or can be explored in different ways than just, we could say, explored beyond the bloodline. I mention some of these in greater detail in my paper, which also has more in-depth explanations of how the algorithms work. But here, following these, or like inspired by these texts, I list sort of a few of the ideas they have given me in terms of developing kin, also beyond just working with artificial life. But so I would say that genotype and phenotype are distinct, yet entangled. The genome codes for digital playback, again, talking about kin now, yet the individual phenotype exists in an acoustic ecology. So it might be that the genome is one thing, but then when it gets played back into space, it resonates in an acoustic space. It's placed back through a certain kind of speaker. It gets picked up by a certain kind of microphone. People may be talking close to it, which means like it expresses itself quite differently than like just the formal digital structure of it. And that also means that individuals and environment, that is the acoustic space, engage in unlikely kin relations with each other. They create complex relations and communities, which is what Lynn Margulis, the biologist, called holobionts, and something that Donna Haraway also talks about. So here it's like it becomes difficult to tell individuals apart, really, in the installation. Much more difficult in the phenotype domain or in the ecology than when I'm sitting at my computer and looking at the frequency responses. And I think that's really important and essential. So also these communities are not based on competition, but they're based on cooperation and care. And fitness, because that's a problematic one that I find, it's a real biggie in A-Life, like the idea of fitness. Although I don't profess to have solved it, at least I've tried to measure fitness as a function of diversity. Like that is like how far is an individual actually from the mean spectral centroid of the population, rather than like trying to get the population to somehow sort or solve a problem. Therefore, individuals are not discrete entities with fixed identities. I already talked a bit about that. Now, and then epigenetics. So during their lifetime, individuals may acquire genetic traits from their environment. They will literally absorb the genome from the environment. That means, for example, you talking in the space might influence how the impulse responses evolve. They may also trade genes with other individuals, and these traits may be passed down to future generations. So, and whether this is happening on the, let's say, the genotype or the phenotype level, that is, whether this is something that's actually inscribed in the genome or socially, I'm not sure if that is so super important. I think what is more essential is that evolution is not just about some selfish gene passing down through generations. It's actually also a social process in which social norms are or social possibilities are inherited. And lastly, information is not disembodied and separate from its channels of information. I hope that can become clear in an installation like Kin. So this was sort of like my preliminary speculative reasonings or experiences about working with Kin. And to finish off, I just want to shamelessly promote an event for anyone who might be in Berlin between mid-October and December. And this is a project that's sort of quite related to Kin, but using, it's a collaboration with the anthropologist Isabel Breidenbrücker at Humboldt University, where we use impulse responses from objects in ethnographic collections around Germany in order to explore non-normative kin relations in museum practices. That was all for me. Thank you.